Hey guys, welcome back to the second part of the video. As we mentioned earlier, the first part of the video is try to make sure you are able to download the Oracle, successfully install it, as well as be able to log into the Oracle. In this lecture, we try to look into how do we create our very first table in Oracle. As you see earlier in the class, this is the simple code to create a student table. The whole code starts with creating table as the reserved word, and then provide the name of the table with an open as well as a close parenthesis and with a semicolon. Inside of this code, you try to provide the name of each attribute as well as the data type plus the size of the data type. And therefore, you can see that all of these things that are necessary for you to specify, and so that you will be able to create the very first table of your own. The data types we discussed earlier, including the varchar2, provide one parameter of the size, indicating it is going to be a variable length character. You can also have a char with the size. The number has three variations. The first one is about the integer. If you put only one parameter, it will be an integer values. If you put two parameters, you are specifying the precision and scale, so it will become a fixed point decimal values. If you simply put number without any parameter, then it is a floating point decimal values that can store into a very high precision of the numbers. The rest part of it are all useful data types, especially the date. That's something that we will probably want to see today. So these are all the data types that we have seen earlier. While we try to define a table on top of the table name, attribute name, as well as attribute informations, we can also specify the constraints. There are 5 different constraints that we will be able to specify. The first two are considered as integrity constraint, which mainly focus on the primary key as well as the foreign key. The next 3 constraints are considered as the value constraints. So we try to see if null is available, if unique is going to be reinforced, and then we can also check a certain set of values are allowed in the attribute. So you can see that when we were looking into this code, there are some constraints to specify the non-null constraint as well as the primary key defined over here. In, again, our previous class, we talked about this. If you try to define any constraints while you try to create the columns, that are considered as the column level definition. If you try to define the constraints after the columns are defined, then we are considered that as a table level constraint. So these are important things for you to remember because we will talk about this. While you try to define a constraint, you also want to provide the name of the constraint. The way of defining the name of the constraint is that you need to specify the table with an underline and then talk about what is the attribute and then use the abbreviation to specify what kind of constraints that you want to do. Again, this is only a name. It will not do anything until you really put the reserved word, in this case, not null, to specify that this is going to be a non-null constraint. The same thing over here. You see that we try to define a primary key in the table level. We put out a constraint as the reserved word, provide the name using the same fashion, student table, and then we want the student ID to become the primary key. So you have the student ID, which is the column name, underline a PK, which is the abbreviation for primary key. So you can see that we need to really give a primary key reserved word to specify that which constraints that you want to add. In table level, again, we will talk about this a little bit more. In table level, you need to specify which attribute that you want to designate it as the primary key. You may curious. I thought I already talked about all of these things over here. Again, it is not true because this is just a name. is a way for human to understand it, not for computers. So for computers, what you will see is that it sees a word of the constraint, you provide a name, and again, you can provide whatever name that you want. You need to provide the full instruction for the computer to understand it, so that the reserved word primary key need to be there to specify the primary key. If you define the primary key in the table level, you need to repeat which attribute that you want to specify. If you want to define that in a column level, which we will see that pretty soon, you will add a constraint over here, provide a name over here, and then say primary key, and you can put a comma over there indicating that's the end of it. So naming the constraint is what we discussed over here. We want to put a table name, underline column name, underline the constraint type to specify a good name for the constraint. So that, for example, you can see employee DEPT NO PK indicating that you want to set up a primary key using the DEPT NO as the attribute for EMP table. The 5 constraints has their abbreviations that are commonly understandable. Primary key is PK, foreign key as FK, unique as UK, check as CK, non-null as NN. So that you will be able to define your constraints at 2 different areas. One is called column level, the other one is called the table level. For the column level constraint, referencing a single column and it's defined along with the definition of the column. So when you define the column, you define the constraint already. So all of the constraints, out of all of those 5 constraints, all of them can be defined at the column level, which means that when you try to define the attributes, you can define the constraints at the column level already. There is only one exception, and this is actually very special. This exception is that if your primary key is not just one single column, not just one single attribute, which means that you need to define a composite primary key, that is when you will not be able to define the composite primary key in the column level. So this is something that you need to remember. For the table level, you will be able to define whatever attributes, whatever constraints that you want. So a table level constraint references one or more columns and defines separately from the definition of the column, so that we call it a table level. Normally, it is written after all columns are defined, and you can also modify the table by adding more constraints into the existing table. All constraints can be defined at the table level except for the not null constraint, which means that non-null constraint has to be defined at the column level. The logic behind it is that if it is going to be a non-null attribute, while you're defining the attribute, you need to know that already. So that's why Oracle actually have this constraint saying that you can only define non-null constraints at the column level. So today we are going to focus on only one constraint, which is the primary key in my mind, which is the most important constraint that you have. The primary key constraint is also known as entity integrity constraint. It creates a primary key for the table. A table can have only one primary key constraint. So if a table uses more than one column as a primary key, which means it's a composite key, the key can only be declared at the table level. So this is actually a very important concept. Okay. So when you try to define a primary key, like we said, you can define that in 2 places. If you try to define that at the column level, indicating you try to define the primary key when you define the attribute. So you can see that DEPT ID, which is the one that we want to use to make it as a primary key, define the number, which is the data type, define the 2, indicating I want 2 space of the number, which means that it's going to be a 2-digit integer for the department ID. To add a constraint for primary key in back of it to form a column level constraint, you simply add the constraint as the reserved word, provide the proper name that we discussed, and then write down primary key so that the compiler will know you want to create a primary key for this attribute. As simple as that. If you don't do that at the column level, you want to do that at the table level, the constraint is defining as this way. Constraint, DEPT, the name of the constraint, primary key. Now you need to add one more parenthesis indicating which attribute that you are really talking about. Because what the computer will see is this word constraint provide a name, primary key, and it need to know which attribute that you want to design as the primary key. So it is very important to see the difference. And therefore, you can see that they are almost identical, no matter you want to define in the column level or the table level. You can see that it is all the same until for the table level, you need to add the DEPT ID in back of it to indicating that this is the attribute that I want to look at. So this is something very important. And therefore, the table is created as soon as the create statement is successfully executed. Once it is executed, you will see a message saying that table created. So in general, you have the following code of the structure: create table, name of the table with all of the attribute name, information, and the constraint. So you can see that while we were looking into the same student table again and again, I want to let you guys understand this. In this case, we define all of the tables, and now we have adding the constraint of the primary key in the end of it as the table level primary key constraint. If we want to add that as the column level, what we are going to do is simply take this code and then add it in here. Then we actually can create it. Can easily create a primary key in our column level, and that is going to show the same thing. And therefore, what I want you guys to do is that go to the Oracle, so you can try to see this one, be able to log into the Oracle, and then go into the Oracle, look into the code, and basically connect system, and then password is password for my side. Once this is created, what I want you guys to do is simply that go into the C folder. So you can see C folder, create a temp folder for yourself, and then inside of this folder, try to create a text document. And this file can name anything that you want. I'm going to name it as test. And the important thing is that you need to end with the SQL. So once we have creating that, it will be a space for you to write whatever code that you have. So what I would do is that I would go into here, copy and paste everything that we have in here, save that file, and then go into the Oracle, execute the code. So how do we execute the code? Here is the most important thing. You need to use the @ sign here, put a C comma slash indicating the temp folder slash the file name that you just created. Because I develop a temp folder and I'm going to put a file in the temp folder. So what I'm trying to do over here is that I can simply try to execute the code. So what I have see over here is that because when I'm testing it, I already create a student table so that it will show some problems. Since I already have the student table, it won't let me do that. So I need to drop the table and then try to execute the code one more time. If you hit up arrow, you will be able to see the code that you have done before. So when we hit enter, you will see the table created.